Thank you everyone for joining me. I'm Matt Netko, as you know, from our Arc and Dev team. Today I'm going to be talking about, really excited to talk about .NET Core, which is Microsoft's newest kind of .NET framework spin-off and total revamp of .NET. And so thank you again for joining me. What I'll be covering here is a little bit of slides, but very heavy on demos. There's some really neat concepts I want to show. So we'll talk about what .NET Core is and some of the history behind it, have a couple demos, and then wrap up with a comparison between .NET Framework and .NET Core, as well as what I think it means for us on our team at Slalom and where everything is going beyond that. And if everyone could mute their phone, that'd be great. I'm getting some static.
That's my chip, sorry.
Oh, no problem. Okay, so let's start off with kind of an overview of what .NET Core is. I kind of stole a few of their images from their website. I think that it kind of really encapsulates a bunch of the main points really well. So we'll just use that. So the idea behind it is Microsoft wanted to, with the new push to be more open source and a big shift in the company towards that, they and I think the .NET framework is 15 plus years old now, and releases were slowing down, and there was a lot of internal change in the company. So they came out with this. It's been around for a little bit and still is in development, and basically it's just a set of different runtime and library compiler components. So it's very similar to the .NET framework and those concepts. The little bit change here. It's much more modular. The idea is more of a plug and play type of framework where you're not forced to use any particular portion of the framework, such as IIS for a web server or specific framework libraries. You certainly can, but you don't need to. It is still managed code though, so also just like with a regular .NET framework, it manages memory with the typical garbage collector. Everything is still compiled, but pretty much the same. But the one difference here is the cross-platform capability. So that's very exciting. For us as .NET developers who have already invested many years into their platform, the ability to create the core apps for different OSs and CPUs is huge. Of course, it runs on Windows and currently is the most developed on Windows, but they are working on Linux, OS X, and other type of operating systems, big, large, and small. I wouldn't be surprised to see more embedded sort of systems too in the future. Moving on, so it's still developed with a very modern mindset, meaning it is bringing with it, of course, C# is the major supported language to be written in, but they also do have VB and F# support coming in the future. Modern in terms of having link support, generics, async, and more. So there's really nothing that's being left out from a language feature, which I think is really important for adoption, of course. It's using the Roslyn compiler, which has been available for the framework as well, usable as a service. So there's a lot of, again, that plug and play modular kind of capability. You can use that one, I believe, other ones as well if they get developed. It's interoperative, so similar to .NET, just more streamlined and different interoperability with native code. And because it's modular with very little to the core part of it that you can build on top of, there's a great extensibility model for adding new components, or other third-party companies can bring their libraries and port them over relatively simply, and that's already well underway. And they're still sticking with NuGet for the package manager, and we'll kind of see how that works as well. And lastly, it's adaptable, portable, and open. So I think here they're mentioning the pay-as-you-go model is what I meant, of just plug and play and take what you want. So ability, what I'll show is a simple little command line console app, as well as a lightweight API, kind of like web API we can build out. But the idea behind that is you can use it for client apps that are mostly JavaScript single-page apps to very complex server backends and mobile apps from the Xamarin mobile app side of things. So really excited about that. Just increases the surface area and types of projects that we can do with it. So that's a great investment there for all of us. Portable, again, it'll be usable across different stacks, including Mono and Mac and Linux. So that'll be great. I'm sure we'll have a lot of demand for that over time. And then lastly, it's open source. So everything, even now, you can vote on different features that you want to see. There's been a lot of feedback from the development community, and they're doing it all in the open for better or worse in terms of what gets voted on. You can see it, all the action, which is pretty very different for Microsoft or a company of their size. So that's very exciting. Just a quick note on if any of you have followed this before, it's still a little confusing to me, to be honest, but they had gone back and forth for I think a few months, end of last year, 2015, on the naming. So the ASP.NET 5 and .NET Core, everything's kind of switched over to a 1.0. So they're driving towards .NET Core 1.0. They're not quite there yet. I'm thinking probably the fall or early next year for that. And then Entity Framework is kind of involved in this too. That's switching over to Entity Framework Core 1.0. There's a couple images here got from Scott Hanselman from his presentations that we saw at Build that kind of really drive this point home. So one thing to note, and I think the major idea is the main .NET framework is not going away. It's still they're really gonna live side by side, which is what this shows. You'll have the same type of stacks in terms of how this is built out with your libraries and then compilers and components underneath that. So they'll share, what this is really showing is that they share a lot of the same ideas, but of course, again, the .NET framework is only Windows, and these Core goes much more beyond that. In terms of, excuse me, the future innovation, so what Microsoft is thinking across all of their different technology platforms, not a lot of surprises here, but basically, you know, from the top we have three different major, I'd say, components of the app model innovation here. The .NET framework will continue just with Windows Forms, WPF, ASP.NET. .NET Core is they're not going to recreate Windows Forms or WPF. That'll stay with the framework. It's the ASP.NET Core, which I'll kind of show off through building a simple web API, and then the universal Windows platform, which we've heard about already. And then, of course, on the right, we have the Xamarin code base as well, and the same type of toolings, Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code. So let's switch over to a simple demo. This is really neat. Scott Hanselman, during one of his presentations, said that there's a lot of competition, admittedly, with the JavaScript ecosystem and the web. For example, with beginners, it's a lot easier to get started from that standpoint. So they're really trying to, with .NET Core, you know, get rid of a lot of the cruft and installs dependencies that typically comes with them now. Like I said, 15, 20 years on the bloated Windows framework or .NET framework. So their idea was, you know, his goal was, we want to, you know, take this to kids, right? For educational purpose. I think that's a good audience, he meant, in terms of, can we get this up and running and show them something cool and get that engagement very quickly? And if you think about what's involved with installing Visual Studio over a couple hours, I wish that was not a joke, but and things like that, they're just trying to improve even really the full experience from start to finish of getting up and started. So we'll just do a quick little console app. This page that I'm showing here off of the main .NET Core landing, I think is really slick, just because it's saying it just kind of says you just need something to, a shell, something to type in, and 10 minutes to get going. And you can select different instructions for Windows, Linux, and whatever your flavor is, or OS X, even Docker, which that runs in as well. So I'm going to do the quick install for Windows. Now, I've already installed the .NET Core SDK. It was just one little install and took just a few minutes compared to Visual Studio, which is, of course, again, takes a lot more time. I did the Visual Studio MSI installer just because I had a more intense demo, but you can also just do the SDK for just command line developments. And then they walk through, which we'll run here, just a couple commands to get a very simple app going. So let's do that. Try to make sure, I don't know how well this will look on GoToMeeting, but here I am, just a little, in my temp drive, and we can get a simple .NET Core app up and running. They have, the code base is really small again, and we can just pull this down really easily. So let's just make a directory for this. We'll just call it demo app and go into it. To get started, all we type once everything's installed with .NET Core is .NET is the main keyword, and then new. So you can see that created a new C# project right in there. And there's just a couple commands to get started. So .NET restore. So this will actually build everything and pull down all the NuGet packages. They actually do pull in a lot of different things, despite I think it's something they're just working on to get rid of all the NuGet packages and dependencies out of the box. But there's only a few, host resolver and a couple other things, and sets up some NuGet configs based on, and pulls those from NuGet.org. And then the last command, if we wanted to get started, was .NET run. So we can see compiling it for .NET Core version 1.0, and we don't have any warnings or errors, and all this does is print hello world. So you can see in just a few seconds, really, after installing, of course, the main Core SDK, we're off and running. I won't go into the code on this. We're going to look at the next demo for that, for a web API, something that's a little more useful, but just wanted to demonstrate that is possible to get up and running more or less quickly. We can go from there. So from the second demo side, so I took one of their example apps, which is just a to-do API. To-dos in the sense of just creating different tasks that you want to complete. We won't really concentrate on what that actually does so much as the code behind it here. I think I'll zoom in a little bit. Make sure that's visible for everyone. Yeah. So to start out, I've already kind of set this up and built it, but if I were to I want to just avoid the simple steps of getting started. But basically, once you have .NET Core installed, it just sits alongside in Visual Studio any other ASP.NET project. It's just a different type of project. And actually, well, so I'm debugging, but basically when you'd be able to choose a .NET Core web application or the typical .NET Framework one. So nothing really exciting there. The main template is a lot cleaner in terms of what it sets up for you. There's not a lot of cruft and other files that we all know we end up deleting with a bunch of different CS and JS that we don't typically need. So if we look here on the right, one of the things I wanted to point out right away is the project layout's a lot simpler. There's just a couple folders here, some settings, and that's about it. I have added a few files for this demo, but it really is they are really trying to stick to that, the whole bare bones mentality and plug and play, and we'll see what kind of some of those examples. But I've opened up the file format. One of the things I like is, with a couple exceptions here, underneath a new project, they have a source folder where everything lives. And before, They didn't really have that. It was kind of flattened right in there. So what I like about this in terms of, at least when I do newer projects, if you think about it, go back here. Oftentimes maybe you have documentation at this root level that you don't want to separate into code. Other setup, deployment scripts, other things, you can kind of keep that either within source or outside. Although I did note that they've kind of violated that with the solution file in global JSON, so I don't know if that's gonna change, but I kind of like that idea. Keep everything under source that's truly source code, and then have any other files that you want outside of that. Let's start with startup.cs. So there's program.cs and startup.cs. That's part of the default, and a few files like this that, much like other types of .NET projects, that you have to use, and that's just built into how that works. So a couple references, couple things to point out here. So the startup method and then some configuration of services methods here are automatically added. They do a nice job of kind of documenting, putting some comments in there that explain what everything does. So you'll see a lot of different builder sort of concepts here where this is the class where we're really adding all of our dependencies and services that we want to use, as well as configuration files. So we see here, this is configuration builder relates to our app settings and some of our web config stuff. So you see we have the add JSON file, app settings.json, which I'll kind of go through a little bit. You can also do, if you have different environment files for that, they have this reserved env.environment name for the JSON that we could also load up. So I've gone and done that, made a staging one, for example. So that where this is controlled is kind of over in our project file that I'll demo in a little bit. And then you can do, this is kind of an example of theirs. If you can split this up into different startup files. Like I've created a startup staging. Again, I'll touch on that later, but you can say if we're looking at the development environment, then run this different types of code. So you can do branching logic, either in one class or in separate ones. Could be useful for different setup and teardown type of activities. Here they're just adding, there's just some basic, I'm not even sure honestly what this does, but it seems like there's some logging and telemetry that they give you out of the box that you can enable. Moving on, where it gets a little more interesting, I think, is the configure services. So this is where that plug and play, pick what you want model comes in. So here again is that telemetry. We really wouldn't use that, I would think, maybe out of the box. But even something as like MVC and the concept behind that is used, and something you have to specify for even an API. And then furthermore, though, we have the add singleton, which is kind of like our using AutoFac, that library for pulling in our dependencies. So much like you'd expect, you'd have the interface that you want to add and register globally, and then your actual implementation of the class. Well, this is what I've added, the to-do repository. The config settings. So what's kind of interesting there is they're getting away from, they're very heavily invested in dependency injection and a lot of more modern best practices with that right out of the box, and they're thinking about that with .NET Core. So this is kind of the way that you add those settings, which they refer to as options. So this will read and look for any of our app settings, JSON, web config, and if you've added, so I created an app settings class, which I'll get into in a little bit more, but this is a way to pull this in, and you can, based on a JSON config file. There's a different configure here that is more about, again, kind of, I'm not sure why these two are split up between them, but this is more framework settings. They also include out of the box some logging capabilities, which is specified in the project and app settings JSON, and some of this telemetry stuff. So we could pretty much get rid of all of this except for the MVC portion, which we want for your typical web API, I would say. Moving on to the program.cs. So this is really just the main entry point to everything. I believe this is used whether it's a web app or a command line kind of app, or maybe in a Windows service. Just a couple out-of-the-box commands, basically just saying use a bunch of different settings and services and then call run, which actually kicks it off when we hit debug or deploy it. The one thing to note here, when it's saying like use Kestrel, so Kestrel is the open source equivalent and .NET Core equivalent for IIS. So this is the one that you can use. I believe if we use this, we could say use IIS if we were going to be Windows only. But by using this one here, we're saying we want to be available for all the different platforms. So I believe out of the box, if they keep it this way, we don't have to do anything specific to run necessarily on Mac or Linux or any other platforms. I mean, imagine if there's different settings, we could control that again from Startup CS and detect that, or our app settings specific JSON files for configuration. Let's look at some of those, couple of those app settings. So here you're really given free reign, and again, compared to our typical app config, it's very bare bones again, which I kind of like. Not a lot of, hardly anything really to get started. This logging info was included out of the box. And then I've added this app settings node with one particular setting I just call some setting. So you can go in here and fill that in beyond, and whatever you'd want for settings there. And I'll kind of talk more about that in a bit. For the project.json, so this is mainly the most important thing to note here is our dependencies that are being pulled in. So here we're specifying, okay, this is a .NET Core app. What version of .NET Core are we running? And I'm guessing this is part of the build number. So again, they're at release candidate 2. That was released a few weeks ago, I believe, or a couple weeks ago, and that's what I pulled down here. And then here are where our NuGet packages are specified, the project namespace, and of course some of the version numbers. Some other tools, I don't think there's anything too important going on here, but there's other type of publish options, scripts that you can run that are all built in there. And to be honest, with it changing so rapidly, a lot of this I kind of held off on getting too much in the weeds because it is rapidly evolving even every day as they build this out. What else? So the www root here, it comes out of the box. This is, the idea behind this is to hold your static files. So if you have any images or your JavaScript and CSS files, there's probably some enhancements and caching that is kind of built in there. But that's where typically you'd store those. We don't have anything fancy with those that we need for this demo. The models and controllers folder, so pretty much similar type of setup there as a different .NET framework type of app where you have the controller and models folders as well. Here with a model, so I've created a couple of items like our to-do item for the demo here, just a simple POCO object, key, name, and whether or not it's complete, and then following along with just how we build something that has dependencies, have a simple interface for adding, retrieving everything, searching for items based on the key, and updating them that we'll kind of expose to, through the API. And then an implementation, again, this is nothing specific to .NET Core, but all of I believe most of already the similar stack, queue, concurrent dictionary type objects are all there in .NET Core. They might be, the one advantage with them going on faster release cycles is they might introduce new objects that are not in the framework, but all the ones we know and love are pretty much there. So really just have a simple implementation of of these guys, nothing specific to .NET Core for adding in items, and I'll run these and we'll see how that works. The the to-do controller ties everything together for the repository. So again, they're really big on dependency injection. So here on my controller, we have the I-to-do repository that we'll want to inject into the process here, and then going back to the settings, the configuration. So how you reference that is they have this iOptions extension class, and you just specify the type for what that is. So I've created an app settings model to kind of mimic what we're used to for app settings. But the idea is you inject those settings into whatever controller you want to use. No more calling configuration manager .get this field. So what's kind of nice about that is it's the source, of course, can come from a database or a config file. We're abstracting that away. So they're really, kind of giving you that mindset and best practice out of the gate and building around that. Unfortunately, with these settings, I couldn't actually get it to work in terms of changing them based on different staging or development environments, but I'll kind of walk through how that would work, or how it should work. In terms of how routing works, so for just in this case a web API project, you have this one decorated portion for route at the top. We could change this around a little bit, but I've just kept it from what they recommend, which is starting path. In this case, when we run, it'll be localhost as I'm debugging, with API and then / controller name. So to do similar to how it works in the framework, anything before the word controller is what we're going to use there. So it'll be API / to do. So let's actually, I think that was the one. Yeah, let's actually run this. For calling, just retrieving all items, just an open GET request, we'll call get all and return that. So I actually have Postman up here. It might be a little tiny to view on the screen, but here we have localhost just pointing to, again, /API / to do. And if we call that, there's one default item that comes with this, just item 1. And then if we want to add an item, we can make a post to API to do with the body Matt's .NET Core JSON demo. So if we call and run that, that returns with whatever I've just sent. I'll show that back in code. So that maps back to our create method with, again, pretty similar setup with the HTTP post decorator, and then the from body attribute, of course, saying this is going to be from the body of the request, what that item is. And so the kind of hidden behind us, just like with regular web API, it's parsed and handled in the as each request comes in, and it's transformed into the POCO there of the to-do item. We can send add the object and then return it. I think here what's returned calls back into itself. Essentially, I think this is a little verbose, honestly. Newing up a new controller, despite being in itself kind of strange. So it'll be interesting to see if that evolves and is a little more clean cut. But then if I go, so again, I've added a new item. Come back here, and we had one item before. And if we pull this again, this is just, of course, in memory, but we could, as we know, store this in a database, send it somewhere, keep it in memory or in a cache. But here's my new item that's been set up. Couple last notes for the demo here on multiple environments and configuration. Again, there's tons of other concepts here that I just, because they're evolving, just wanted to kind of cherry pick the ones that I think are most important. But it's at a start now where the documentation is really starting to get built out. So feel free to kind of learn more about this and everything, after the demo here. But in terms of multiple environments, so I kind of mentioned and hinted at from the app settings and the startup code that they've also kind of tried to work on the problem of, how do we have different settings and configs for different environments. I know we've had a lot of challenges here with our current client that we're at with managing that. So I think they're trying to really put that also along with dependency injection at the forefront. So this is kind of interesting. On the properties of the app itself, under the debug tab, they now have environment variables. So you can add anything that you want. I think there's going to be more standard .NET Core ones, but what it ships with is the ASP Core environment one. So by default, it's set to development, and we can change this to staging or anything else we add, different server names, different environment names, and this is what is controlled and used in the startup.cs file. So going back there, where we had this line, environment is environment development, that keyword is tied back to the property. So we can quickly change it here. I guess I can stop debugging here since we really just want to show that. It's just plain text, so maybe they'll get to something where it'll be a little less error prone, where you could misspell something. But there's that. And again, couldn't really get this part working, but the idea of it is still, demonstratable, I think. You could quickly change these out to different environments or probably set them up like you would here with the debugger, and then have different code run as well as different files, configuration files used. So the other neat thing about that is we have our startup.cs, which is the main one that would run, but you can also create a different startup for each environment. So if you really had something, I think the recommendation would probably be to keep it to app settings or a configuration file, unless you have some really complex use cases and things. Of course, if you were to split this up into different code files, the more bugs and other issues you can have, but it is something you can do. So the way that works is this, much like with to-do controller, it's kind of inherently built into the framework that it knows anything after the word startup is your environment name. So I made a staging one. We'd want to make sure that over in the configuration here in the environment variable, that matches staging to staging and it's spelled correctly. Or we could have prod. So I wish I had something working, and unfortunately I apologize there. I don't know if I didn't get it right or it was just still buggy. It's kind of a toss-up there. But so here, perfect example though, we can just call app.run and just write out to the screen, this is the staging environment. Or we could pull in, think about this, the possibilities are endless in terms of, maybe for staging you do a different, of course, to connect to a different database, the staging database, the test out different code. Even I think maybe on the fly that could be kind of neat. A different implementation of the to-do repository, perhaps maybe testing a bug fix, that would be kind of neat for what's next or what's going forward. And then again with the app settings JSON, I created a new file and named it staging, and it automatically kind of bundles it. Visual Studio bundles it under this, so we'd have all our other environment files. And what I did here is, so we have our app settings. Some setting is development mode for the main one, and then for staging, we just recreate that, recopy it over, and then change to staging or any other settings that would be unique for that environment. I think for that's about it. So how those are loaded, you can see add JSON file. We could be very explicit and just say only load the staging environment one, only load the production one, or you can, in this case, it's loading up both of them, and depending on, again, what that environment name that was set in the properties is. So lots of neat kind of newer concepts. I think most of it's pretty good. They also just give you some things like a project README out of the box web page, and I believe from that side of the demo, that's it. So kind of interesting to see, again, how this evolves. Already, it's interesting to note that a lot of part of the reason I was having trouble getting the environment switching working is all the current blog posts, Stack Overflow, even their own demos are out of date. So a lot of the ways that you set up in this for setting up the services, like configuring this based on the section, totally wrong and different. And I could not figure out what that was actually for getting it working. It seems to be, looks right to me, but for whatever reason, again, switching between the properties here, staging and dev, was still kind of wonky, but I'm sure they'll work that out. So back here. So again, there's lots of, the documentation is all hosted on GitHub, and you can actually submit pull requests to that as well, which is kind of neat. And this is pulled from that. There's many more concepts that they're rethinking besides DI, routing, controllers, other types of services, so check that out. I'll have some links at the end that are constantly evolving. But one thing, again, I wanted to highlight was dependency injection. It's something I just a big fan of course. So you see they have different examples where, oh, here, you know, kind of speaks to that modular kind of mindset. We're saying here, let's use SQL Server as our database provider and pass it this connection string. Or let's use Entity Framework and set up different values for that, for role management, security, encryption, all these types of things. So I imagine your configure services will be built out with a lot of different options beyond a few here. Add MVC. And then last, you add your own specific, again, kind of like AutoFac library of your dependencies that you want. And I imagine within here you can probably write functions within that that set other settings, but this is a really basic, like, oh, we have our email sender, we have our SMS one, or we have our to-do repository. So that's kind of neat that's available more out of the box and ready to go. Kind of wrapping up, but moving forward here, just in terms of choosing the right .NET for us as a team at Slalom and beyond. So again, to recap, the .NET framework, it's mature, fully featured, not going, you know, their intent is not going away. They want to keep building it out. It'll be on a slower release cycle though, like we kind of been yearly, if not more than that. It's Windows only, which means you get that backwards compatibility, but you have monolithic components and a lot of features and code, and that really bloats everything up, and oftentimes there's probably so much that we ignore that we're not even aware of, but it's just there and has to be there. But with .NET Core, again, a brand new focus, and with supporting and being open source, meaning faster releases from everything from the documentation to the code itself and how things change, the demos. So they're really, from what I've seen, they're really staying on top of communication and keeping the websites up to date more or less pretty fast. There is, again, no version 1 release yet. They just had release candidate 2. I don't know if, it's not really clear yet if they're going to have a RC3 or beyond that. I think it's getting to a point where it's getting more stable for a V1 release, so they haven't publicly committed, to my knowledge, to anything specific, but probably it would be this fall at the earliest, if not 2017, when there's a V1 release. So, you know, on that note, I think in terms of what that means for us as Slalom consultants, I would not recommend .NET Core for any real client work yet, but I do think it is something that you could start looking at now and play around with, because a lot of some of the core concepts are very baked and ready to go, and others are changing and evolving, but it's kind of neat to see. And I think, again, give it a little bit more time and you'll see, I think, a shift towards using .NET Core. If they're keeping the majority of components and best practices, framework ideas like DI that we want anyway, you probably would tend to lean towards .NET Core, because again, out of the box, you'd be able to run on more platforms. It's a smaller code base and things like that. So I think that'll be, we'll see if that is the case, but that's where I'm kind of my opinion and from what I've seen. But it's very exciting. So to summarize where we are in May, now June 2016, .NET Core, they really rebuilt everything from the ground up with modern practices in mind, from configuration to security and performance. A lot of the reason why these releases and why they don't have a set V1 is Microsoft is really committed to getting it right, I think, out the gate, and so performance and especially security takes a long time. So they're being honest and upfront about that. They're not going to rush it out when we can see everything being built live. So I think that's great. So again, RC2 was just released in May. And again, I don't think it's production ready necessarily, but if you had any pet projects or maybe hackathon kind of things, real projects can run, but there's still third-party developers moving their code over to .NET Core, and the framework itself changing a lot. So I don't think it's, again, something that's ready for more serious projects. Again, it is open source. You can participate, see the progress live as it happens. And just a note on kind of their strategy, I think whether or not Microsoft kind of moved towards open source out of the goodness of their hearts, it remains to be seen, but I think it's more of a change in, again, the popularity of the web and Node.js and other technologies that have really caught other types of developers and other groups. So I think they kind of were forced to get on the open source bandwagon, and getting .NET running on all different types of platforms is kind of becoming the expected standard, as tough as that is. So of course, with more tools, though, the benefit is they're really pushing everyone towards using Azure, which is the one thing that they can and probably still will charge for, and that'll probably continue to be a shift in how Microsoft makes money, because when I write Windows and Office decline, I don't mean in their decline in use, but there are more and more open source alternatives. We're already seeing this with Windows 10, where they were giving that away for free. So they're trying to increase adoption across mobile and everything else. And for us as developers, that means pretty much the way they're going to be making money is through these cloud services. The AIs we talked about, the other types of services we've been talking about with the Windows Open Development Platform. So I think they're going in the right direction. I'm excited about it. They're not waiting. They're kind of behind on some things like mobile, but they're kind of catching up through either acquisitions or going open source. I have, which we'll put up, a bunch of different links on this. The docs, again, are really done really well. Here's .NET Core on GitHub, like I mentioned, so that's really cool that you're able to see changes live there. And any of the links I showed today are on this page, so it's pretty easy to find the info. So thank you very much. That was .NET Core.